The Procession to Calvary is Pieter Bruegel's second largest painting, and it has a lot going on in it. Like many of Bruegel's paintings, you can find yourself lost in this one for days. To name a few of the actions that we might find in this painting, a miller seems to fix something on his impossibly high windmill. People carry young cows in a basket. Women are threatened with spears. Children play in the swampy ground, and soldiers make their way to an execution. Oh, and Christ carries his cross right in the direct center of this painting, while his mother mourns his death in the foreground. These things somehow are easy to miss with everything else going on, and maybe that's the point of the painting? I'm not really sure. And that's not even the only execution happening in the painting. At least 2 people hang from gallows in the background, and all these wheels that appear throughout the composition, they're also instruments of torture and execution. And I think that there's a reason that there's so much going on here. This painting is telling multiple stories at once, and those stories are highlighted by an incredibly clever composition. So in this video, I'm gonna break down the ways that Bruegel composes an image to tell a bunch of stories at once. And if that sounds like it's your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. Before we can get into the formal analysis of this composition, which is like where the real fun is, we have to establish the basic stories that Bruegel is trying to tell within the canvas. So first, let's begin with the story both at the center and foreground of this composition. The story that, even given its prominent position of the center and foreground, remains so easy to miss within the chaos of this painting. It's the story of Christ's procession to Calvary. It is, after all, the title of this painting. This is the story of Jesus carrying his cross to the site of his execution, and somehow, even within the title and that prominent position, it's easy to miss. And that's quite a trick that Bruegel is playing on us. Like, you really have to probe this canvas to look for the story, and it's so easy to overlook and let your eye wander around. It's so easy to miss the important things, this seems to say. It's so easy to avoid the suffering of others. But let's not get too philosophical just yet. Let's stay with the painting for a second. Directly in front of Christ is a wagon carrying the other 2 men who will be executed on this day. Their crosses are waiting for them in that circle that the bystanders in the top right occupy. Which brings our attention to the bystanders generally. Everybody seems to be on the same well-worn path to this execution. Everybody is traveling to be a part of that circle that surrounds those 2 existing crosses. It seems like a journey that they've taken before. It feels casual, natural, part of daily life. The wagon driver, for example, doesn't even need to be on his horse. The horse already knows the way. Nature seems to be guiding the action of this painting towards the tragedy of the execution. The driver doesn't need to drive. He just sits on the wooden harness and lifts his leg up as the wagon passes through a puddle. And it's details like this that make Bruegel so good at what he does. The wagon driver can lift his legs and stay dry, but Christ, following the wagon, will not have such a luxury. The driver is carefree, not doing much of anything, just looking out for himself. But since we, as the viewers of this action, can see both him and Christ, we know that suffering is only going to increase. Maybe not for the wagon driver, but for Christ and everybody who cares about Christ. Jesus will need to pass through that puddle on foot. The wagon driver, like everybody else, seems indifferent to the suffering that's about to happen. And there are so many characters like this littered throughout the canvas, just watching or taking a leisurely walk as the story unfolds. So we search the canvas for people doing something else, something other than apathetic participation in this flow of humanity that meanders towards death. And in that search, we find this scene to the left and toward the foreground. A man resisting participation. He is being compelled by Roman soldiers to help Christ while his wife, I assume that that's his wife, holds him back and tries to prevent him from helping. And in fairness, this is some complicated stuff. Do you help a person suffering even if that help means participating in an execution? Most people in this canvas are paralyzed by inaction, just letting the well-worn path guide them. Nobody wants to help or stop it or participate in it. They just want to watch, to go with the flow. Anyway, this character being pulled in 2 different directions is Simon of Cyrene, who, in the book of Matthew, Roman soldiers found and him they compelled to bear his cross. He has to be compelled to help, in other words. Which, he should, right? Like, there is a man struggling to carry this cross, a task that will only become more difficult as he approaches that puddle, and he obviously needs help. He's on the ground. The clear thing to do is to help, and yet, Simon needs to be compelled. He needs to be dragged and pushed to help somebody in need. He's not going to do it on his own. In fact, his maybe wife pulls him backward. She's actively hostile to his helping. And all these people standing around, they seem indifferent to the struggle. They watch the struggle without participating in it. So within this part of the canvas, there is both hostility and indifference to the care that we might offer when witnessing the suffering of others. Just as there is indifference among those waiting for the execution in the top right. In fact, these two scenes are connected with a straight line. We can view a line that extends from this woman's aggressive prevention of Simon's intervention and the place of the execution. And that line passes straight through Jesus, who looks directly at us. What would we do in this situation, he seems to ask. Would we help? One of the ironies of this situation is that Simon's maybe wife is wearing a rosary with a cross. Now, that obviously doesn't make sense. First, as a Christian, she should want to help Christ, of course, but also, the cross was not a symbol for Christianity while this story takes place. Christ needs to be crucified before that cross has any symbolic value at all. And she's not the only one holding Christian iconography. One of the criminals being led to his crucifixion in the wagon also holds a cross, the object of his own execution. So I guess that there must be some other story going on here. Bruegel lived and painted in Flanders within an area known as the Low Countries. The Low Countries is an early modern name for the modern-day Belgium and the Netherlands. In 1564, the Low Countries were unhappily under the authority of the very Catholic Spanish monarch, Philip II. Now, there are a lot of reasons that the Low Countries were uncomfortable under this situation, this Spanish control. Philip didn't speak their language, they weren't as loyal to Catholicism as he was, there were large communities of Protestants. Politically, Philip was fairly authoritarian and tried to centralize control of the region under the leadership of his half-sister, who they didn't trust. This is all to say, there were a lot of reasons that this region might flirt with independence. And when they voiced those concerns and moved in the direction of independence, Philip responded with violence and oppression of those Protestant communities. So this location, at this point in history, 1564, any Spanish troops in the Low Countries were viewed as an occupying force. Those troops wore red, just as the soldiers do in this painting. With that knowledge, we can see that this isn't just a painting of Christ's crucifixion, this is the story of an occupying Spanish army limiting the religious and political freedom of the Low Countries. Just 2 years after Bruegel painted this, the region would erupt in a war for independence, what historians call the Dutch Revolt or the 80 Years' War. As part of this violent oppression of the Low Countries, Spanish troops would use a particularly gruesome form of execution that involved breaking someone on a wheel. I'm not interested in getting into the details of torture, but in short, a wheel is used to break the human body. Then, sometimes the body is displayed on the wheel as a warning. So this explains the many wheels throughout this painting. Christ had the cross, the Dutch had the wheel. They are tools of execution. And this parallel between the Dutch suffering on the wheel and Christ's suffering on the cross can most clearly be seen in the top right. The circle of the people that defines the space for the crucifixions is a circle in the exact size and shape as the wheel used to display the tortured bodies of Dutch Protestants. We can see the circle of people from above, and we see the torture wheel with a scrap of clothing still hanging on it from below. That's not the only parallel. So now, finally, we can get into that really fun, formal analysis. Like, there's the parallel between those two wheels in the top right, but like, the whole thing is a wheel, right? This entire composition. The people just move around in a giant circle with this impossible rock formation serving as the axle. That rock highlights the circular path that the characters of this painting follow, and also pulls the viewer upward towards the sky, or heaven. And one might think, in a painting like this, a painting of Christ's crucifixion, we might expect to see God overseeing the scene from a lofty spot. That atop this rock, sitting in the clouds, Christ's Father might appear to look over the scene. But instead, we get a miller, the man who provides the flour and bread to the community. God, it seems, has been replaced. but not just by this miller. Bruegel's paintings are sometimes referred to as worldscapes instead of landscapes because they hold an impossible view. No human can possibly see this much in such detail from any vantage point. We, as the viewer, occupy a sort of God position similar to this miller, and from this position, we can see this giant wheel of humanity, this giant site of torture, this cycle of violence and apathy. And this giant wheel, this giant march of humanity that is the world, has worn down the land so much that it leaves a strange rock feature that serves as an axle with a windmill on the top. A windmill, a place where wheat is ground down with a giant wheel into flour. And I guess we have to ask ourselves, in this visual metaphor, is humanity the wheel that grinds the wheat, or are we the wheat itself being ground down by the cyclical nature of history? And now that our attention is focused on wheels, we might notice that the wheels on the wagon are indistinguishable from the torture wheels in the sky. In fact, the reflection of the front wheel in the puddle compositionally reminds us of the double wheel in the top right, where we would see the reflection of the torture wheel in the wheel of onlookers waiting for the crucifixion. This parallel in the top right equates the site of torture, the wheel, with those who look on without doing anything, the circle formed by the onlookers. In both these cases, the violence is on display and no one does anything. Both circles imply inaction. Similarly, these wagon wheels drive these two men to their deaths, and they're animated by the horses. No one is driving. It's all part of the natural flow of life. Everybody watches the pain of others without taking responsibility. Humanity will always be like this painting seems to suggest. And so suffering and torture will always happen. Christ will always be crucified, men will always hurt each other, and we will always look on paralyzed from the sidelines. It's an endless circular recurrence. People watch while others suffer, and maybe that's the real tragedy here. In the book of Luke, Jesus tells the daughters of Jerusalem to weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. The tragedy isn't his death. The tragedy is the people who watched. The tragedy is the circular course of human history, where this indifference will continue to appear and reappear. The humans marching toward the execution form the torture wheel itself. Humanity is itself the site of torture. In the foreground of this painting, Bruegel painted the Virgin Mary with a group in genuine mourning, and they're not turned towards the scene. They're not turned towards the action of the painting. They just cry. They weep as instructed. And just as they were instructed, they're not turned towards Christ. They don't weep for him. They're turned towards us, sitting here in a 21st century, looking at this painting on a computer screen and seeing our own indifference reflected back at us. They weep for us, and they weep for our children. And that's all I got for today. Thank you for watching.